I'm Emma Johanna Puranen, a postdoc in astrobiology ethics at the Open University. Today, I'm providing an introduction of the idea of Antarctica and outer space as analogues. The past 125 years have seen humanity through the heroic age of Antarctic exploration to the Apollo moon landings, and to a new space landscape today with commercial actors. The US plans to return to the moon soon with the Artemis missions, and governments and private companies alike are looking at a future on Mars. So, how relevant is this comparison between polar explorers and astronauts, Antarctica and outer space? Can people planning Mars missions today for crews that would have more racial and gender diversity than either early Antarctic or space missions learn anything from Antarctic history? While this analog has been researched by some scholars working across disciplines like history of science and space ethics, the various aspects of it often haven't been presented together for a wider audience, nor have the ways in which early historical actors themselves understood the analogy been highlighted. Following the work of Juan Francisco Salazar, I encourage understanding Antarctica and space as being on relational trajectories, that is, interdependently defined with each seen in the context of the other. In this presentation, I identify 4 interrelated areas in which these relational links are often defined in terms of Antarctica and outer space: physical, psychological, governance, and science fiction. This connection between Antarctica and space is connected to a Western brand of hierarchical, linear thinking in which everything occupies a ranked order. A civilization moves up a ladder of technological progress, eventually leaving Earth for space. This linear thinking, which has roots in Western culture and science dating back centuries, explains the persistence of the idea that after Antarctica, space is inevitably next. It highlights just how pervasive this colonial rhetoric is in discourse around future human space activity, although it's typically left unexamined. Physically, Antarctica and space are both extreme dangerous environments. They're both colloquially thought of as empty. No humans have ever lived permanently in either. Antarctica is the closest environment to another planet one can find from Earth, complete with altered day-night cycles and a disorienting environment. Antarctica's suitability for astrobiology analog experiments is well recognized and utilized. Solar system worlds of interest for life are very cold compared to Earth, so it makes sense. Humans need special equipment to survive either place, going on sledging journeys or performing extravehicular activity. Distance and isolation meant early Antarctic explorers didn't have wireless contact with the rest of the world, and prospective Mars explorers today would have a communication delay. Astronauts in outer space are taken even further away from physical familiarity, working, eating, exercising, and sleeping in a weightless environment. As much as the physical environments, especially on the level of individual experience, might mirror each other in their extremity and unfamiliarity, it's worth asking how much of their perceived emptiness could be due to the aforementioned colonial mindset. Authors in Roberts and Mancia's edited volume Colonialism and Antarctica: Attitudes, Logics, and Practices investigate this question and others, including, can colonialism happen in a land without people? Increasingly, concepts from colonial studies are being considered by scholars in their work on both Antarctica and outer space. Here is an entry in the diary of Edward Wilson, the surgeon, artist, and naturalist on the 1901-04 Discovery expedition to Antarctica, in which he directly compares the physical environment to space. He writes of walking in Antarctica, quote, "One could imagine oneself in another dead planet. I could easily imagine we were standing not on the Earth, but on the moon's surface." This brings us to psychology. Due to the extreme isolated environments, the high risks, the confined living situation, and disturbed sleep, Antarctic explorers and astronauts experience similar psychological stressors. Among Antarctic explorers and researchers, you can draw a through line from early expeditions with polar madness to today's winter over syndrome, seasonal affective disorder. Nathan Smith at the University of Manchester studies the psychology of polar and space expeditions, and says that emotion-focused coping strategies, or ways to reframe the situation and distract yourself, are among the most successful techniques for combating these mental health and physiological symptoms. People set to spend a few years on Mars might draw from early polar expedition techniques of writing periodicals, putting on plays, having debates, and playing music. A dire situation was faced by Shackleton's crew on the Endurance. Skipper Frank Worsley described the scene after the men left the relative comfort of their sinking ship and Shackleton spoke to the crew. This speech had an immediate effect. Our spirits rose, and we were inclined to take a more cheerful view of a situation that actually had not one element in it to warrant the alteration. We knew that we had to face all this, but there was no point in admitting it, even to ourselves, let alone to one another, and therefore we bucked up. This could be read as machismo, but there's a deeper coping strategy at work, with Shackleton's speech prompting this reframing and distracting technique. One also thinks of the vital mental medicine of Leonard Hussey's banjo. One may ask similar questions as in the previous area of comparison. Critical scholars could consider whether and to what extent Antarctica and space causing similar psychological conditions is a presupposition, or indeed if it's always the case. Does this change with crew composition, location, leadership, increased communication? The third link is governance. What happens when a group of people live together in close quarters for years, isolated from the rest of the world? What are the rules? Do they recreate the society they've come from in miniature? In a situation with high risk and life and death decisions needing to be made, environments themselves may restrict individual freedoms in a way that runs a high risk of authoritarianism. Many early Antarctic expeditions were run on naval rules. Earlier space exploration also often had military ties, but with the rise of commercial spaceflight, this is definitely changing. And there are voices today, like Elon Musk's SpaceX, that advocate in no uncertain terms for long-term human colonization of Mars. They explicitly state that early colonists will have a high mortality rate. This is concerning ethically for a number of reasons. From perspective of governance, it's concerning because you worry that human rights are not the priority. How do you guarantee basic human rights to your space travelers in a situation where it's very easy for freedoms to be curtailed? One example of these questions of governance in a small, isolated society is brought up by Robert Falcon Scott. Meanwhile, it is rather fascinating to consider the moneyless condition in which we live. With an absence of wealth, community of interest, and a free sharing of comforts and hardships, we must realize much that is socialistically ideal. Yet in recognition of rank and supremacy of command, the government must be considered an autocracy. Space ethics scholars at modern conferences like Edinburgh Future Institute's The Institutions of Extraterrestrial Liberty argue the same point about the appearance of freedoms but actual presence of autocracy regarding the idea of future settlements on Mars. So these early Antarctic ventures can provide some insight into what a Mars colony might face. For sake of time, I will move quickly through these slides about the legal situation in Antarctica and outer space, assuming some prior knowledge in the SC-HASS community, but feel free to pause and read them if you like. Particularly of note is that the Outer Space Treaty is in some ways weaker than the Antarctic Treaty, allowing for some military activity and being silent about economic exploitation, leaving a sort of open question regarding things like space mining. While the ATS is in use and living and growing with new scientific activity in Antarctica, the OST has seen fewer additions over the years. Largely, this is because space is still not a theater of much operation, and with little activity comes little need for regulation. To draw very broad arcs, Antarctica has gone from a free-for-all with multiple territorial claims to a peaceful continent for scientific purposes, though nations which conduct science there still derive politico-legal value from this exercise, contributing to a new pattern of Antarctic imperialism. Space has been the province of all mankind, almost but not quite from the beginning of human activity there, but is today at risk of becoming a free-for-all of corporate claims in the absence of a robust new international treaty or update of the OST. Of course, this is a greatly simplified narrative, one to which scholars, many cited in my references, have added nuances or clarifications, but overall, legally, space and Antarctica can act as useful mirrors for each other. The last link is science fiction, fictional stories about science and technology, often including people stepping out into the unknown. During early polar exploration, science fiction authors like Verne and Poe wrote books featuring polar explorers. These works were the key to the broader public psyche, and we find that the conquest of the poles was rehearsed many times in fiction before it happened. As Will Tattersdale puts it, end of 19th century fiction was presenting empirical discovery and imperial conquest as inseparable. The space connection was made then, too, with Wells having a character state, after all, to go to space is not so much worse, if at all, than a polar expedition. Men go on polar expeditions. What can be imagined can be done. If contemporary heroic age polar science fiction featured lots of nationalistic conquest, It only takes a quick glance at today's space-based sci-fi to notice many portrayals, not so rosy, of corporations exploiting space resources, like Outer Worlds, The Expanse, Kim Stanley Robinson's works, etc. As the pole was rehearsed in fiction, so too is Mars, and beyond. History demonstrates science fiction can offer a valuable ethical check on science and present a repository of possible futures. We ought to listen to it. This presentation was just the tip of the iceberg, if you'll forgive the pun, of relational trajectories of Antarctica and outer space. However, while specialists in various fields have begun to examine these intertwined histories, not everyone's in conversation with each other or with the broader communities of Antarctic and outer space researchers. Nor have they always considered how the idea of Antarctica as analog for space is rooted in Western expansionist histories. So this presentation has aimed to further critical research into this analog by showing points of friction and also by showing how it can't be presumed to be natural but is rooted in these colonial histories. Digging critically into the history of Antarctic imperialism, environmental history, gender studies, and more can lead to further insights regarding future human activity in outer space. While the Antarctic explorers of yesterday and the Martian explorers of tomorrow will have their differences, important questions can be informed by the historical record. And here are my sources. Thank you very much.